It's me again. But fortunately for you, you're not going to have to sit there listening to me all the time. I am very privileged to have 4 wonderful speakers who are primed and ready to go. I've seen them drinking coffee and limbering up. So I'm actually going to suggest, we didn't rehearse this at all, but I'm going to suggest that the 4 of you actually come up, and then what we're going to do is, I'll just go through it and then introduce you all, but we're going to have a session that's quite fast moving. We're going to have each of our panelists is going to stand up and talk at you for 5 minutes, no longer. I have a stopwatch. Then your bit is to ask them awkward questions for 5 minutes. So I'm agnostic about whether they stay on topic or not, to be honest, Jorge, but anyway, we'll see. And then so you need to get in first and with your question, and then we'll move to the next person. Once we've done that, there will be a chance for those of you who prefer to think of bigger, gnarlier questions that run across. We'll have a bit of a plenary session towards the end of the session, just before lunch, I think it is, the next thing. So, so that's what we're proposing to do. So everybody's got their jobs. So without further ado, I will ask Alison, first of all, if you could come up and grab a chair, any chair you like the look of. I think, well, I will introduce you all as you come up. So Alison is the Executive Director of ASBEC, the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, the Council of Councils, well, you can say what that is. And Tim is, I just stepped out. Keep moving. Jorge, maybe you want to come up next. Jorge Chapa is the Chief Impact Officer for the Green Building Council of Australia. GBCA, I'm sure everybody knows GBCA. It's been a really a leading light in green buildings in Australia, particularly in the non-domestic space, but it's also had a significant influence on housing and continues to do so. And Jorge has a number of other responsibilities, which I'm sure you can mention through the discussion. Roger, if you'd like to come up. Roger Swinbourne, founder of Positive Futures Advisory, got a lot of experience, many years of experience in consulting and in sustainability and cities in general, and infrastructure and property and planning in particular. Should I spin this out a bit? Tim is here. Great, thanks. Tim, if you'd like to come up and join us. I was just going to tell your life story to everybody, but I now will save you that. Tim is Manager of Strategic Research Programs at the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and has a background in sustainability and finance, not surprisingly. So this is our team of 4. I'm now going to shut up, as I promised, and sit down, and Alison is going to be first up. Thanks, Alison. Over to you.
And yes, I am vertically challenged, so I usually tend to stand next to lecterns rather than at them. But thank you, everyone. Lovely to be here today. Thanks for the introduction, Ralph. I head up the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, and you're exactly right. It's known as the peak of peaks. So my members aren't people or companies. They are the peak bodies themselves. So it is the Green Building Councils. It is the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. And the beauty of ASBEC is every member has a commitment to sustainable buildings, sustainable infrastructure, sustainable communities, cities, and we get together and what a very disparate range of peak bodies, you know, from manufacturing through to professional organisations through to property organisations, what they agree on is really powerful. So what we do is we have a very safe collaborative space with all levels of government, and we have those hard conversations behind closed doors so that we can really drive policy development at a better rate than what might happen normally. So what I might do, oh gosh, I'm going to go into my presentation. Nope. Alison,
Maybe
Tim?
keep going.
Oh, yeah. Here we go. Oh, nope, that's Tim. Let's see.
You can give mine.
I'll give yours, Tim. That sounds wonderful. I don't have to go with slides if they're not.
Do you want to try it again?
Yeah, try green again. Oh, I think we're technical difficulty, but anyway, we'll keep on going. I'm happy to start before I have the slides. So I have a bit of an unenviable job, starting with doom and gloom. So I'm going to be the reality check, and I'm going to rely on my esteemed panelists to be the bringers of opportunity. But I thought it's really useful when we're talking about encouraging circular market behaviours to really understand the context. Aha, hooray, thank you very much. To really understand the context that we are working in. That's regulatory context, but it's also systems that we live and work in every day. And many of you would know this pain. So Australia, we are one country in a global economy. We don't have much of a population, and we are often forgotten at the global stage, but regardless, we are part of a global, we rely on the rest of the world for a number of our building materials and services and the like, and we have a number of multinational corporations in our company. So like it or lump it, even though we're a country, we're part of the functioning world. So as a country, we have one federal government. That federal government has a range of different ministers with different portfolios. And did you know that there is one minister for housing, but there's also different ministers responsible for building and for planning and for environment. So even at the federal level, we've got a bit of, you know, differences in jobs and potentially a bit of tunnel vision there. Expand that out to our different states and territories, each of those different governments operating, each of those different governments have different ministers operating different portfolios, not necessarily the same as those that operate at the federal level. Go down again at the local level. So there's 537 local governments, each with their own different resourcing and capacity challenges. And harking back to the introduction we had today from Uncle Alan, I've failed to put in there, you know, the over, 250 First Nations communities across the country as well that we really need to consider and recognise in any sort of policy development that we're doing with the places that we live in. So it's a very fragmented system, and we do our very best to try to work together to develop policy. One great thing that we have found a really effective lever of getting policy change happening is our National Construction Code. So, you know, our National Construction Code, you know, we should celebrate it because it is an agreement between the 9 governments. So that's federal, along with the 8 states and territories. They all are meant to take this model national code and apply it in their own jurisdiction as best as they can. So we do have a way of improving our homes in that regard, but again, there's a lot of challenges there. So, and what I will say is that code stops at construction. So if we're looking at trying to embrace a circular economy, how do we operate in a very, very lineal system that we've created for ourselves? So, you know, there's a lot of challenges there. You know, I know the code back in the day, I was there when they removed section I out of the code, which was around the maintenance side. But, you know, there are some real gaps in terms of policy that's adopted and looked at a national or holistic level. So that's the fragmented system we're trying to operate in. And so potentially what I put to our panelists is that we really need to also rethink the way we operate in terms of the regulatory environment to really enable that change that we need to make in terms of heading towards that circular economy. The great thing with housing, though, is there are so many opportunities that we can really leverage, those innovative ways of working together, that housing, really could embrace and scale up. So for those of you unable to see the very pretty picture in the background, I thought I'd put a picture of silos up. Not because silos are our new solution to building more and more community housing, but the fact is that we are operating under a very siloed structure. And I'm not even going to call it a system, because we need to look at systems thinking. We need to break down those silos that we have, not only across governments and within the country, not only within our states and territories and even potentially local governments, but even within our own organisations. So if you think about as a business delivering housing, potentially you have your sustainability team different to your finance team, different to your marketing team. So those institutional barriers are also stopping our ability to scale up and look at it in a holistic systems way. I'm also going to allude to what Lisa introduced this morning in relation to the Circular Economy Ministerial Advisory Group. They recognise, they've got recommendations and analysis across all sectors of the economy, but specifically to the built environment, the challenges that we have in terms of trying to deliver a circular economy, to move towards a circular economy. So unsurprisingly, it's the fragmentation. Unsurprisingly, it's the market failure. Lisa talked about transparency and provenance of building materials. This was established, this has been a long established problem. We had the Building Confidence Report back in 2018. Even for, basic safety needs, we still aren't confident that what is specified in terms of product at the design level is what ends up on a building. So how on earth are we going to measure carbon if we can't even get safety right and product testing and certification right? So, there's a lot of failures that we need to look at and try to find ways of fixing these. I know Ralph mentioned the, Industry 4.0, and that's a really exciting opportunity in relation to how we address these market failures. Planning and procurement, obviously. So, we talk about the need for government to be that market driver, absolutely necessary, but we also need to look at our structural silos in terms of governance and regulation, and really figure out how we can remove those barriers, or at least think of a different way of how to embrace this circular way of thinking. Obviously, we need to talk about the long lifetimes. Ralph, the really powerful message about durability of buildings, the information gaps that we have. We're trying to get disclosure out. That's one of our other many live problems that we're trying to deal with, and we really don't know the state of the system. We can make lots of good guesses about housing, but the actual data that we have, we don't. And costs as well. There's a lot of challenges because we have designed our housing system in a linear way. I'm a child of the 80s. I'm used to the excess, and I've grown up with that linear way of thinking. So not only is it an institutional or regulatory system, but it's something that's ingrained in your own way of behaving that we really need to challenge. So I love the idea of, starting young and bringing that culture. It's a cultural change, a culture of circular thinking in our upcoming generations. And us Luddites, we need to try and, change our behaviours, change the way we view things. And then by that, I think we can only work on the system and figure out new and innovative ways of functioning. So that's the intro to market behaviours. I hope I've set up the panel. Happy to take any questions before we move on to the next.
Yeah, you can take them sitting down.
Thanks, Ralph.
Thanks, Alison, for opening this up. I was generous and allowed you an extra 2 minutes. No, it's all right. First up, no generosity for the rest of you. The questions for Alison. Don't all shout at once. One over there. One over there.
That was very, very interesting. Just on the issue of the federation structure, and that comes up all the time in terms of there's so many different jurisdictions that need to be managed. I mean, the counter sort of advantage of a federation, obviously, is there's an opportunity for policy innovation and experimentation and all that kind of thing. I'm just interested in your thoughts on that in the context of this issue, or whether that's happening or whether there's opportunities there.
Yeah, it's very difficult, and I think I'll probably take the easy line and hark back to what Lisa and Ralph were talking about this morning, in the sense that I think the first step is governments taking the responsibility and accountability to figure that out, how they can adopt circular principles and almost drive the market, create the markets for those, building services as a system, buildings as a system, or facades as a system. So I think it takes, the first step is absolutely government leadership, and that can be government at the federal level or state territory level. I think when you do get down to the local level, the cost barriers or the capacity barriers are probably the challenge there. But, we see larger, more well-funded councils like the City of Sydney Council that we're in, leading with a lot of that work, and with the hope that they can work with other councils across the country to, roll out programs that they know work. So it's that sharing, and I feel like as Beck, we feel that's one of our responsibilities. What one part of the industry or government is doing well, how can we scale up? How can we share that knowledge so that people don't have to reinvent the wheel?
Thanks, Alison. Is there any one more quick question? Otherwise, speak now or forever.
Or do it later.
That's fine. Tim, you're up next. 5 minutes starts any minute.
Let me know if I'm going over. Good morning, all. Tim Wheeler here from the CEFC. Hopefully my slides are up. Perfect. So just over the next 5 minutes, I'll take you through very briefly what the CEFC does, who we are, and a few of the challenges that we're sort of facing in the circular economy space. Hopefully it won't all be doom and gloom, so maybe I can sort of lift the tone a bit, but we'll see. It could be a bit of an emotional roller coaster depending on where we end up. So just a bit about us for those of you who haven't come across us before. We are Australia's green investment bank, so we have access to $30 billion, just a bit over, from the federal government, that we can invest in various areas of decarbonisation. So we have got an investment mandate that guides what we do. And I think a good way to think about the different areas that we work in, we've got it laid out here. We've got a big chunk of money set aside for rewiring the nation. So that's putting in place a lot of the transmission infrastructure that's required for getting our grid to 82% renewable by 2030. We've also got the Household Energy Upgrade Fund, or the HOOF, as it's called internally. That's $1 billion in concessional finance that we set aside for improving the energy performance of existing homes. And then we've also got the Powering Australia Technology Fund, which is $500 million allocated towards emerging, developing renewable technologies. The CEFC, we have a mandate to be a little bit more risky than other investment banks. So the place that we like to play in is sort of like that cutting edge of sustainability. Everything we do has to have a good sort of sustainability story backing it up. What we sort of aim for is just a few steps ahead of current practice. We're not aiming for the perfect, sustainable, circular building that could only be rolled out as a pilot program. We're looking for models that can be commercialized and that can be released and scaled up across the industry. So we have a variety of different investment approaches, so everything going from corporate debt to equity funds. We also have a spin-off, which is our venture capital branch, which is Virescent Ventures. And in the property space, we have 3.1 billion committed to existing projects. And as you can see, the breakdown here, it swings in favour of commercial, so about 70% commercial and 30% residential. And debt investments make up the majority of the investments that we make. So just a few case studies on what we've done, and please forgive me, these are also from the commercial space, so it's not just residential. But we play in both the upstream and downstream elements of circularity. In the upstream elements, we've got investments in recycling. Obviously, recycling isn't circularity, it's one component of it. But in the financial space, until Jorge and team produce, a circularity rating where we can say, give us a 6-star green star circular building, we are taking sort of like a staged approach to this. This is an example where we invested 70 million in debt finance with Hines. And this is the T3 Collingwood building, so it's a timber building. It's a 15-storey premium grade office building. And it uses timber for the upper stories, cutting embodied carbon by up to 40%. It's the first investment in our $300 million timber fund, and we're hoping that it will start to propagate more timber use across the sector. The Rhino Recycling Plant, another investment by the CEFC, and this one is a 75 million debt finance to develop the Rhino Recycling Plant in Pinkenba, so that's near the Brisbane CBD. The plant has the capacity to take in a lot of construction and demolition waste and transform it into reusable materials. It has a capacity of 475 tonnes per hour, which leads to about 1.5 million per year. So a significant project. Virescent Ventures, our venture capital firm, also backed a small organisation called Samsara, who are developing an enzyme that can digest plastic. So we're sort of trying to lead in areas where we can see obvious areas for investment in business models that could be scaled into the future. Just the final one, and I think my friend Lasse Lint is joining us today. The CFC also made a $100 million investment into what was called the AMP Capital Wholesale Office Fund, but then rebranded to the Mervac one. And that is it's part of a $7.7 billion fund, so we're a minority stakeholder in there. But the design that we saw through in the QQT tower that we all know and are probably familiar with, retained about 60% of the existing core structure and diverted a significant amount of waste and potentially emissions from the construction phase. So I might just leave you with a few contacts from our team. So Michael DeRusso is our head of property. I'm in the research team, and Sarah Thomas is a director in our property team. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great summary of some really interesting work. So it's now your turn. We've got 5 minutes for questions for Tim.
Thank you very much, Tim. I recall there was a CEFC program to invest with social housing providers back in the day. Is that still open, and how has that gone in terms of emissions reduction and take-up?
Yes, so there are different investments that the CEFC has made over time. There's currently one as part of the, it sits more with the Department of Climate Change, and it's the $300 million fund for investing in upgrading social community housing. The Household Energy Upgrade Fund that we have $1 billion for, those are concessional consumer loans, so they aren't grants. They are for people who are sort of in a position to take up a loan and make upgrades to their home through that. But the CEFC is also working a bit in the affordability space, where we're looking to generate more stock in the sort of like build-to-rent affordable space. So we do play across that area. It's not our bread and butter because we don't necessarily have grant funding to give out at those sort of levels, but we are trying to sort of like shift the market through concessional level finance and consumer finance. Thank you.
Other questions for Tim? Maybe can I swing one your way?
Absolutely.
Because I've got 1 minute. And I mean, I'm interested in a broader sense what you think the learnings are from outside the housing sector that in future you might think, given the size of this agenda we're talking about today, might be future prospects for Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and what kinds of financial tools you think might be suitable for looking at. If you're not going to hold you to anything, but
sure.
Might be suitable for looking at for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that I can say is that the technical solutions need to come from within the industry itself. Mm-hmm. Once there is agreement around the definitions and what can be sort of termed a circular practice or a circular service or a building, that's when I think you'll get a lot of traction from the finance sector. At the moment, we're writing things like, neighbours ratings and Green Star ratings and those types of things. And we really leverage that existing knowledge where industry has come together and established these tools. We also try to support the development of new frameworks and rating tools. For example, the Neighbours GBCA embodied carbon tool is one that we're trying to support, and
Yep.
We're encouraging people who receive funding from us to go ahead and trial it and provide their data. So I think the sort of step-by-step approach that we can take in the financial sector is around things like recycled content, adaptive reuse, design to deconstruct, those kind of areas where we're starting to sort of like tiptoe towards. But I think we can't write in at this point. It needs to be a circular building because I think people don't necessarily know what that means at this point.
And I understand the need to not try and pick winners from outside the industry, but
Absolutely.
what about off-site fabrication and modern methods of construction? Is that as a huge gnarly area? Is that something that you think is kind of coming up as a future mainstream mode of delivery?
I think challenging. We found it to be quite challenging in the Australian context, given the scale that would be required to kickstart it. We've seen sort of like various smaller approaches, sort of attempting to take it on.
Yep.
But the experience that we've seen is that they haven't survived past very early stages of business.
Yep.
I think that it would take a very significant investment into, a gigafactory type thing that can produce a very large volume of these for the business case to start making sense in the Australian context.
Okay, thank you. That's very useful. And I think we're just about on time. I'm just scanning if the case there's a quick question from the audience. But I think we'll move to Roger next. So, Roger, please do. Your time starts now, as they say. Oh.
Thank you. I'm just going to make sure I keep on time. Okay. So, really good to be here. Really good to be here with this cohort. Worked with many of them for many years, and it's great to hear the circular economy dialogue really coming into the play. I've been working in sustainability at scale for infrastructure, urban development, and precincts for over 20 years. And over that time, I've seen a lot of, I guess, processes, systems, tools developed to try and help define and position that. And for me, I think circular economy, I've seen it emerging globally and really taking track in the last sort of 3 to 5 years. And in that, it sort of evolved as a tool to help define value from the foundation of a systems perspective, looking at productivity. And I think that is so important in terms of progressing towards a sustainability outcome. And I think for me, it looks really at how we make sure that we're using the environmental, social, and economic resources to their highest and best use for as long as possible. And that's really, from a fundamental sustainability perspective, a really important mechanism. I do see it as a tool in terms of looking at how we define value. I'm going to put that premise up there, I guess, in terms of what is value, and just give you a moment to think about it. I've spoken to a lot of different clients over many years about what is value to them, what does value look like to you, and it always comes back with a different definition. I've worked with a lot of cost planners that always come back to me with value is cost, which is quite a scary premise. But there's a whole lot of different perspectives on it. And I guess about 12 months ago, I kind of went, I'm going to go back to the dictionary on this and actually spend a bit of time trying to unpack what we're talking about when we're talking about value. So that definition kind of talks to merit, worth, use, utility, practicality, advantage, durability, benefit, desirability, gain. It also has an element of ethics in there. And I think when you kind of look at circular economy and you go, well, what are we trying to gain when we're looking at circular economy? It is actually increasing the value of what we've got and maintaining that. So much of what we have, we just take that value and reduce it very, very quickly. And there are a number of key areas that I guess we're seeing value lost, particularly in the development and housing sector. And I think circular economy provides a structure for us to think differently about that. We've talked a little bit today about resource cycles in terms of we take a lot of environmental and social resources to produce something. If that has a short life, that is discounting the value of those resources being put into that. If we can capture that or extend that, that's a really important mechanism. I think in terms of shortened life cycles, we talked a little bit about life cycles, the doubling of a house life, if we can actually triple it or quadruple it, make it adaptable, flexible, durable, we've got a lot better from a circularity point of view because we're making the most value out of what we've got. And for me, I guess I see that as with those shortened life cycles, we do lose significant environmental and social costs by not recognising that. Utilisation rates. Utilisation rates is interesting for me, and I think I kind of hark back to the idea of circular economy, and I think Lisa touched on this before, but my grandparents used to darn their socks. The idea of valuing something, fixing it, repairing it, reusing it, again and again and again, and extending that life cycle and that utilisation cycle is not something that's new. It's kind of how do we deal with that concept of thrift and productivity, which we had to do when resources were more scarce and our processes and skills were better and we could utilise more. And it was interesting going back to the Welcome to Country today, and the idea of circularity in the context of 60,000 years of continuous culture. Like no other culture globally has done that. They all wipe themselves out within hundreds of years because they out-consume themselves or they don't use their resources appropriately, whether they're social or environmental resources. So the idea of circularity is not a new thing. We're not evolving to become circular. In a way, we need to think about a little bit of de-evolution into becoming circular again. It's not necessarily being cleverer and smarter always. It's about recognising the value of what we've got and utilising it to its highest and best use. Residual value we've also talked a little bit about. And the residual value is really, I guess, in terms of the end of life. Do we have an end of life? These things just continue, right? So the idea of an end of life, but then again, what does that value look like? That idea of not owning the facade but leasing the facade, I think is a really interesting idea because the owner of the facade has interest in the value of the facade beyond the life of the facade, whereas a building owner doesn't know how to capture that value at the end of the life. So really changing those business models and working out how to capture that residual value is really important. In terms of circular economy for housing, for me, I think there's the opportunity here is about the productivity of housing. It's about the productivity of what we've got, making sure that we've got that long life, loose fit, flexibility and durability that we can take into play. I think looking at yeah, trying to work out, this is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Hopefully everyone in the room has seen this diagram. If you haven't, definitely look it up. Ellen MacArthur Foundation, a lot of different really good resources on circular economy, including an entire guide on how to get value out of circular economy in real estate, specifically targeted at I guess the sector we're talking about here today. To me, I think the opportunity of value capture. So we've talked about value loss. We've talked about where in the cycle value is lost. How do we capture that in the sector that we're working in the housing sector, in the construction sector, in the property sector, and in the finance sector? I think for me as a design strategy, we need to come back to the first principle of sufficiency and productive. So what is sufficient, what is productive? Are we building a 6-bedroom house when a 3-bedroom house will do? Are we building 3 media rooms? You get the idea. Like, we're building a lot of stuff that actually we don't need. It is beyond what we need. And I think looking at starting at sufficient, productive. What is the use? What is the purpose? What is the need? And how are we addressing that? If we get that right, we're a good way down making sure that we're building what we need and only what we need. Durable, repairable, and resilient. So that idea that what we're building can have long life, loose fit, and it can deal with shocks and stresses and adapt within that context. And then reduced and responsible consumption. We've talked a bit about that today, but I think if we can drive that productivity, that efficiency, and that responsibility of the materials we use, and making sure that it's responsibly sourced in relation to the environmental and social cost of building those resources is really important. This is, I guess, in terms of one of the other things I think in terms of capturing value, designing in layers, and that is recognizing that when we are building a house, and social housing is an interesting one on this, in terms of there are different design lives for different elements of the house. Recognize that they do have different lives. Some of them have a 10-year life, some of them have a 50-year life, hopefully some of them have a 100-year life. But recognizing that they have different time frames and that we can pull those out and put in without demolishing the whole house because the internal facades have been bonded to the side wall with super glue. We have to take down the whole wall. Like, how do we build in layers so that we can actually change that in time? Designing for deconstruction, which is basically the ability to wind it back out again, and then designing for adaptability. So looking at, well, okay, maybe a 6-bedroom house is needed in the first instance, but then perhaps we put a dividing wall and have 2 3-bedrooms. So how do we deal with the social demographic shifts that house, that asset that will go through over its life? And then how do we make sure that it's adaptable? How do we design a commercial building that can also potentially be retrofitted for residential later, if that's likely to happen over the next 100 years? Who knows what's going to happen? But designing for adaptability and the value base, I think, is a really good way of capturing and taking a circular response. Value capture. So in terms of as a business strategy, so we talked about it as a design strategy, but a business strategy, I guess this is really about sweating the assets, using what you've got, getting the best value, the financial return from what you've already got without necessarily demolishing it and rebuilding it just because you have to. How do we get the best value out of what we've already got? The increased utilisation. So space, assets, labour, and materials. So looking at not just as a materials problem, but basically as a utilisation problem. An empty room is not very productive. A room with 2 people in it is 1,000 times more productive than none. Looking at how we use the space, making sure that we're getting the best utilisation out of that, does return value. An empty room won't return you any lease return rate. You're not making any money out of an empty room. But if there's 2 or 3 people being productive in that room, you're going to make a lot of money, or a lot more money. So from a business strategy point of view, it's sensible. And then long-term investment, really taking that long-term. Now, long-term investment's really hard in the residential space because often the cost holder and the benefit holder are on a different ledger. And that's a problem, which is why I think when you talked about build-to-rent, we're bringing them to the same ledger. The people that own it are interested in the value of it over the life. That area of, selling services rather than selling assets is an interesting way and model to start closing those loops. But it is a challenge for us. In closing, I think for me, the big challenge is really recalibrating the economy to value the environmental and social resources holistically. And that is a systems problem, and it is a hard one to unpack, but I think circular economy provides a framework for thinking about that. I think in private housing, it is, as I said, a significant challenge because of the different ledgers that exist with the value and the cost, which we need to work through. And finally, I think for me, circular economy is about identifying and capturing the unrealised value from the more productive use of land, floor space, materials, services and utilities over time. It's looking at how we can convert that into a compelling business case to help property industry redefine the highest and best use through a lens of environmental, social and economic productivity. We talk a lot about highest and best use. I've been a member of Property Council and UDIA for many years. They always talk about highest and best use being the key focus. What we're talking about here is highest and best use. But that is actually what we're trying to get out of the resources, assets and utility that we provide. So, yeah, that's me. But, yeah, probably longer than 5 minutes. I apologise.
2 minutes. It's all good. Thanks, Roger. Very thoughtful and on message as far as I'm concerned. And the floor's open for questions for Roger. I've got tons of questions. I think may start over there as Kerry's already had a go. Sorry, I'm rationing questions here.
Hello. That was great. Just a quick reflection / question. Is there a tension between two of your items there from a design perspective? The idea of building in adaptability and flexibility against the kind of optimization of a design to meet a certain need, whether that's spatial or in other aspects. And if you agree there is, how do you address that?
It's been an interesting challenge in the sustainability space because I think there's a lot of perspectives that it builds in cost. I don't know whether that really answers your question, but I think the idea that you're building in that durability and adaptability, and sometimes that can cost more. But then there's this constant really tension between the cost and the value, and that's finding that pathway to that disconnect is really the problem of circular economy in my mind. So I don't think there's necessarily, I don't think that they're challenging each other. I think they're on the same trajectory. But yeah.
Can I add to Roger? Because I think the question is interesting, right? And we see it all the time in the sustainability space. Should we have energy efficient buildings or buildings that provide good outside air? Because they're usually in conflict situation, right? The two ideas don't go together. And ultimately, I think I go back to the point of design is about managing the multiple conflicting issues. The designer, we all have to make trade-offs at different points in time. The point I would say about the circular economy thinking is that it's trying to focus on two things that are conflicting, make things last a lot, and also make them easy to pull apart. Those are difficult things to do at the same time. But it's trying to tell you that those are two things that you should be focusing on. It's not saying you have to achieve all of them always, because that's effectively almost impossible, right? It's really, really hard. But also, now you have goals that didn't exist before. You have attention there that didn't exist before, and that tends to be an incredible, valuable point of design interventions, because that's where innovation can happen. That's where the more challenges you throw at designer, usually the richer the design tends to be. The worst designs are the ones that have infinite money, right? So having tensions will help the design be better, and now it's articulating two tensions that were new. They did not exist. We didn't think of them. The question, I think, to Roger's point is, how then do we value those two things? That's what we haven't cracked. Not entirely, right? And that's the problem. So it's a great question, and I don't have an answer, but other than say, now we know that there's a question. There wasn't one before.
I'm tempted to add.
Go for it.
Unless
Why
there's a
not?
bunch of hands. You couldn't agree more. And I think this juxtaposition of these different ways of thinking about value, layering, deconstruction, flexibility, exactly. We've got the questions. We've got, I don't know, ceramic tiles, a technology that was designed to last hundreds of years, but we're actually utilising it for like 5 to 7 year timeframes. And guess what? In the volume house building industry, there's 150 subcontracts per dwelling. One of them's a silicon guy. They're mostly guys. It's a bit like that. In fact, if we did have off-site fabrication, it might be different. But anyway, that's another question. I think the point I'm trying to make is there's somebody whose job it is to glue everything together, and that can't be a good thing. So if you have these questions that you can articulate and create tensions between them, I think you at least have the chance of trying to figure out where the sweet spot is, at least for today. And if we are thinking about 200-year timeframes instead of 5-month timeframes when it's somebody else's problem, I'm not saying build to rent is the panacea, by the way, at all. At all. That's not what was coded into what I was saying. So please don't take it as. I'm just saying if we can develop frames and questions like Roger's presented for us and embed them into processes, we have a better chance, would be my take, which is probably a call to Jorge, since you've already started talking, to come up and give us your 5 minutes. Thank you.
Now, those of you who know me or who have seen me present will be shocked by my next statement, which is I don't have slides. I'm usually very much a slide person. And if I can also offer another good piece of advice to everyone, never, ever, ever follow Roger Swinbourne in a presentation, because then you're like, oh, I was going to say all of that. Anyway, so who are we? We're the Green Building Council of Australia. I'm the Chief Impact Officer. Some of you may have seen me before. I've been there for quite a while. And I've had the pleasure of seeing a lot of I guess what I bring to the table is seeing how a lot of these trends have evolved from a fairly specific standards setting organization, right? So Green Building Council, Industry Association, we do lots of things. We advocate with ASPEC, we work with, say, CFC on collaborative guidelines, and of course we're very well known for the rating system, Green Star, right? Which is mostly, to a degree, the vast majority of Green Star rated buildings tend to not be in the residential sector. We cover every other sector that you can think of, and we do apartment buildings, but realistically speaking, out of the proportion of things that get built in Australia in the residential sector, we really don't play a meaningful role. But where we do play a big role in terms of the Green Building Council is on the question of advocacy in the residential sector. Now, the other element that we have, the other thing that GBCA does do very well, or we try to do, I should say, maybe we don't do it very well, we think we do, is having conversations with industry all the time about what are the big trends coming up. We ask ourselves over and over again, what are the things we need to start focusing on so that we can prepare and set up industry to move forward in a particular space. And a few years back, I want to say about 3 or 4 years ago, we did a paper that was specifically about industry sentiment around circular economy. It was a discussion paper. We're trying to say, what do people think the circular economy is? And what are the barriers, what's going on? What was interesting about that paper is most of the conversations tended to be about waste, materials, products, and waste. But when you really start digging into what the circular economy is, you realize that those aren't the problem, those are the symptoms. Right? This is an economy problem, not a resources problem. And it's something that, for what it's worth, I think breaks people's mind a little bit. Sustainability professionals, real estate professionals, we're used to thinking about things. We can make the thing better. Whereas the circular economy question is a question of planning, policy, and process. It's about value generation, it's about financial ledgers, it's about where someone gets a loan and then someone pays it, which is a different piece, and it's a question about time. Now, the real estate sector does think about time a fair bit, but the circular economy breaks us again because the ownership status across time is very different. So we've done a few pieces of work to try and understand where the best intervention points might be. And we've done it mostly in the commercial sector. In the residential sector, the issues are related and similar, and there may be some good learnings. The first thing we've been doing is working a lot with procurement processes. There's a lot of questions that get asked to us about how do we recover materials at the end of their life. And the only answer to that question is by designing them well at the beginning of the process. It's really hard to do the amount of materials that you recover at the end of construction or at the end of a building's life is a result of the decisions made 60 years ago by someone else, essentially. So we have to start tackling procurement processes. We also look at where the benefits from circularity are and where they exist. And we look at, for example, in the residential sector, We talk a lot about trying to reduce the embodied carbon of materials in lots of buildings. In the residential sector, what you find is most of it is actually in the size of the houses. So we need to start thinking in terms of the circularity question, not just as a question of resources, but as a question of utilization, as Roger has said. And see, this is why he stole like all my points. Because a question of utilization is a thing that's going to drive us to become more circular. While materials and resources and recovery and all of those things really matter, having projects like Key Quarter are great. Key Quarter is an exception to the rule because the policies and processes and the planning legislation requirements aren't valuing that point-in-time intervention. And ultimately, those aspects, the policy aspects, the planning aspects, are the only level of certainty we have across time. No one of us will usually, I should say, design the building and then get to its end of life and demolish it. Very few of those will ever have a chance to do that. But planning does. Planning is reasonably permanent. So if we introduce those intervention points at that point in time, we have more certainty of recovery. So imagine a situation where a development application, for argument's sake, valued the existing asset, which is what happened in London a few years back, where a building was going to be knocked down. And part of the reason the building was knocked down was because the building still had utilization potential. And the City of London knocked it back because they still thought there was value in that building and it should not be redeveloped. Now that's a wonderful policy, right? Imagine that capacity to have that at the planning level to enable the discussion about how do we make sure that we maintain the value of these assets. It doesn't mean that nothing gets knocked down. It doesn't mean that everything has to be kept, but it does mean that we're valuing the point of the utilization potential of an asset at the point in time where intervention happens, and we can start attaching these things, these values to the thing and the business case. So what I want to I guess, how I want to finish my brief insights into the question is, when we think about circularity, we have to start thinking beyond just the physical aspects of the problem. They are real. Don't let me minimize those. Absolutely need to recover materials, absolutely reuse stuff. But let's also start thinking about where the points of intervention are happening that are more permanent so that we can then maximize the utilization potential of the things that we already have. Thank you. See? That's how you keep in time, Roger.
Thank you. It's almost as if the progression of speakers was designed. Thank you, Jorge. And now it's open season. I'm just going to make some interim, unscripted and unwelcome, probably, remarks on what's been said in the last 20 minutes or so, or maybe a bit more, just to give you 2 minutes more thinking time for your questions. This is where the real questions start. So now you can ask questions across all four in whatever order and how big and gnarly you like. So Alison kicked us off by, I think, trying to be glass half empty and telling us how hard this is and why it is hard and how and so on. And I was reminded, actually, as you were talking, of one of the first jobs I did when I moved to Australia. I'm not from here. In the beginning of 2005, was a 5-star study for the then Australian Greenhouse Office. Remember, we used to have a greenhouse office. It was shut down. Anyway, in Canberra, and they had this question: 5-star building code provision, so-called 5-star upgrade in the energy efficiency provisions of the building code. And guess what? The industry was up in arms and was telling them we were all going to be bankrupt. Householders couldn't afford them, and et cetera, et cetera. Armageddon was about to happen. And this was way ahead of the rest of the world, and we were just sticking our necks out and so on and so forth. So Commonwealth asked me, through the Greenhouse Office, to do, having freshly arrived off the boat, to use the NatHERS rating tool, basically, to rate a bunch of standard stock standard volume build designs overseas in climate zones, which mapped to Australia, which meant all my UK contacts out the window, except I think Exeter is very similar to Hobart. I think we were able to do that. But anyway, everything else was, just forget it. But really, we ended up going to volume builders across the United States, where we found, for example, I think we used the Bay Area of San Francisco for Melbourne. We got plans from local builders. We rated them using Australian NatHERS software to find out how would they perform if we built those in Melbourne. So we did, I can't remember how many house plans, a couple of hundred, across 8 climate zones. And the average of all of them was 7.3 stars. What? In 2005. They were 95% from the US, which is not exactly known as having an out-there national building code. We even checked that the builders hadn't given us some fancy, whizzed-up green plan by checking it against the local code. That's when I discovered that, for example, Arizona has declared itself a free state and doesn't have a code because it doesn't have to comply with the national code, and I had to figure out what was going on in Phoenix because that's what we were using for Perth. Anyway, long story short, we are at least a generation behind not the leaders, but the middle of the pack of the Western world, or perhaps towards the lower end. We're way down the bottom. We are still struggling to get the politics and optics of 7-star implemented here, and the US has gone through at least 3 rounds of upgrades in their national building code while we've been sitting here. I mean, over the last 20 years, we haven't been sitting here for 20 years, you know what I mean? Frankly, it's kind of 2 words rolled together. I think absolutely the building code is part of the solution, but I'm not pointing the finger at those people that were sitting around the table, or the people that have been sitting around the table ever since, John Thwaites et al., trying to make this happen. I really think the key part of my story here is that this is nobody's fault, and while we keep saying it's somebody's fault, we'll kind of continue in this tension. I really have empathy through all the work I've done over those 20 years in the volume house building industry with the people on the tools doing the job and with the people, providing the subcontracts to those contractors. I think it's no one's fault, and therefore it's everybody's problem, basically. And I think that yes, we have to see advances, significant advances in the building code of Australia, but that has to come in concert with getting the optics right, the settings right, the politics right, the training, the everything else, the materials revaluation. So what my colleagues here have said, basically, and I think as we spend roughly the same amount in Australia on home improvements, I deliberately chose those words, as we do on building new houses, roughly. Actually difficult to get data on those because every time you go to Bunnings, you don't tell, anybody, and the way of generating that data. There's a number of different data sets, but basically, take it from me, it's roughly the same amount of money. So we're spending the same sort of order of magnitude tidying up our homes which is 9-10 million of them, as we are on building, what is it, 150,000 plus
200,000, give or take.
200,000 dwellings. So if you equate money roughly with materiality, effort, carbon, etc., I'd be saying we need to spend kind of at least as much figuring out what we're going to do with the stock from a circular economy perspective as we are agonising over design, flexibility and new build. We have to get both of those things right and quite fast. And I think that, to Jorge's remarks, I think this, and I was putting the two together and thinking, actually, another thing we have to get right from the position of value is the value of knowing your materiality. I think GBC managed to do this heroically with Class A office and with, as you say, all the other sectors, and the players in those sectors routinely think it's very good value for money to them to get a Green Star rating to be able to know their building and tell others about their building. We have not done that in housing. So it's another piece of the valuation problem from a circular economy perspective. We're not valuing, as a community, that information. Everybody thinks they know their property condition. Nobody does, or hardly anybody does. And certainly we're not able to transact that information in the same way that a Green Star rating is transactable. in the pub or wherever else. So I think this is another area of a deficit for us as a community in the circular economy. So I'm going to stop ranting and abusing my position as chair. We've still got sort of 20 minutes to cross-examine our 4 panelists. So giving you a bit of thinking time, the floor is open once again, and also online. Let me just check if there's any questions online.
Can I note, well, you're checking questions, your story about the 7.3 stars, Ralph, reminded me of a conversation we had with our German counterparts. So there's a German Green Building Council, as you'd expect. And we talked to all of the Green Building Councils over time, and then they were calling us and saying, hey, you guys, what are you guys doing in housing? And we got all excited. And we're like, oh, this is what we're doing, right? We're coming in and we're developing a new standard, we're working with the government, and we're going to do this. And they're like, oh, right, so what are you asking for? And we're like, well, the big thing we're pushing for is double glazing, and they were stunningly perplexed. They're like, sorry, what do you mean double glazing? And they're like, yeah, we're like, we gotta get double glazing in so we can get. And they're like, so what do you install now? Like, what's going on, right? Like, what the hell? And we're like, oh, well, most housing in Australia has single glazing, and they're like, I have to custom order it. I wouldn't know where to get it. What are you talking about? And that's just like an example of the situation where we are in housing, where we really are well behind for multiple reasons. But also, just I think we don't conceive that we could do better, right? I always talk about the fact that Australia, coming in, you might tell by my name and accent, I'm clearly not Australian, coming in from a very different legislative framework. When I get to Australia, when you speak to Australia, people do expect that they will tell you this is a highly regulated country. And they will do that, and that is true. I mean, we do have a national construction code, the US doesn't. And so people actually, to a degree, expect that the housing that they have is the best that they could get. And so they don't expect better unless you know you're a professional or you have money, at which point you hire professionals that tell you that. And I think that's important, right? The politics and the communications question about this does matter because we don't think houses could be better, and in some cases potentially cheaper even, if we were able to get all of the supply chain problems ironed out and the policy frameworks ironed out.
Maybe just to add to that one as well, I think the issue that we've seen quite often is a pushback throughout industry to any changes to the codes. And so I think whether it's with energy efficiency, circularity, embodied carbon, I think the higher up the supply chain that we can push the changes. So if you can sort of get low embodied carbon products at Bunnings and places like that, as you mentioned, where people continue the practices that they've used in the past in the construction phase, but the materials and products that they use are better from a circularity or embodied carbon perspective. I think that'll be a key driver as well in moving things forward from the circularity conversation at least.
Yeah, no, I agree that to some extent. I think, but the pallets of no nails will still be there, going off the shelves. And I think there are questions about the way we do things that really also. But I agree. We're not going to do this in one silver bullet. Maybe another chapter in the 5-star story, since I've started telling stories, all of which are true. Is that off the back of the actual implementation of 5-star, there was a $70 million investment in Melbourne in flat glass plant, and actually we have seen the emergence of a nascent double glazing industry really off of the new build, and hopefully that will eventually find its way, and is starting to find its way into the stock. And as somebody who arrived here from England, from a place where, and UPVC was all big over there, by the way, not so here for other reasons. But the reality is, if you wanted to replace your windows, the far cheaper option was double glazing. In fact, I don't know where you would get single glazing from. And an architect friend of mine who was doing up her place recently in Melbourne, European background, felt they had to order the glazing from overseas because the double glazing here is so bad. And what arrived was not what was specified. It was triple glazing. That's all they could get.
As one does.
As one does. Double glazing is so yesterday in Europe, and the rest. So it is a matter of how you see yourself and how we kind of collectively understand what's normal. And when you talk to tradespeople, they'll say, well, I can't lift this thing up. So that's kind of what we're talking about. We're talking about a subcontract industry, often a bloke in a van, probably doesn't even have anything more than a step ladder, and is used to sort of literally doing this. So this is what we're dealing with.
I might add to that interesting culture that we have in Australia. Maybe that's why we have such an obsession with renovations. It's because of the quality of our existing stock. People are obsessed with improving their homes because it is so bad in the first place. And I remember, having, a lot of architect friends, talking about, some of the foundations of, enhancing and improving circularity is build a beautiful building in the first place, and then you have your longevity. Then people want to keep it there, you want to adapt it, and maintain the facade. I think the fact that we're rolling out substandard quality homes is exacerbating our problem because people need to improve them.
Good point.
Part of me now, and I'm going to be a little bit light of your comments, but now I'm wondering if there's a big renovation TV show cartel here that's stopping all regulation.
Yeah. Bit like MasterChef and electrification.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Yes, there you go. Maybe there's something there.
More questions. Yeah, one over here.
Yes, I'll just like that. It was a very provoking panel. Thank you very much, first of all. But it's got me thinking about is one of the problems just the way our residential housing market operates, that it is ownership is around wealth creation and capital gain, and some of those renovations are around realising that capital gain when you go to sale. I mean, you just have to look at the real estate industry and what they invest in that whole sale process with the marketing of that. So, and also, I just quickly Googled that turnover of houses is every 9 years, people on average. So that's short. That's for ownership, let alone rentals.
We were told 7 years when we were doing some work.
It was 7, yes.
Yes.
So, is some of the answer to this a different kind? If we think about build to rent, yes, I know it's been very problematic, but in that European sense that it's a long asset and there's value in you investing in that asset not costing you over time. And I'm thinking myself, managing a community housing provider, that's what we look at. We aren't looking at divesting ourselves of those assets. They're there for a social service, for longevity. So it's a totally different mindset we take to an asset, and the leadership should come from government authorities who are building social housing as well. And that's where the super funds can come in, because they're in for long investments as well. So your thoughts about that will be really helpful.
Far away, Roger.
Fascinating idea, and that turnover rate's really it's a really interesting statistic. When they do exchange, majority of them are debt financed. Debt finance requires valuations. Valuers look backwards. They do 13 indicators in the rear view mirror. It's very hard for them to value the long term, and the forward thinking, more sustainable components, I think is so it comes back to value again. Like how is value accounted for? And how, when you're buying a house, when you go to the bank to get your finance, they're going to say, oh, look, we believe it's valued at that, which is $100,000 less than you think it's worth, because you know it's actually got all these additional great things. It's adaptable, flexible, durable, resilient, future value, repairable. That's not seen as a value. And I think it'd be an interesting one from a debt financing perspective around how that kind of compounds that problem, I think.
I was about
more
to
of
drag
a thought, but...
No, absolutely. I think that's a very good point. But what we have seen through probably more of a commercial building lesson that we've learnt is that obviously in cases where the split incentive doesn't exist, people tend to build very sustainable, very high-performing buildings because they end up being the managers and having to pay the bills and everything that goes with it. That disconnect is very much there in the residential space, where aside from build-to-rent examples, build-to-sell is simply produced, put out to market, and there is very little interaction with the developer and the construction company after that. So I think that's a fairly clear definition of a market failure, where you do necessitate government intervention to solve it. It's just a personal anecdote. I very recently bought an apartment myself, and nobody cares more about the sustainability and the NATO's ratings and the Green Star and all of that than me. I have no idea what rating my apartment is because I just needed to get into the market. And so I think that the superheated nature of the market is one of the issues. You talked about capital gains and things like that. I think everybody is looking to simply interact with this market rather than get something that's safe and comfortable and future-proofed. So those are some issues that we're...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's well known amongst housing researchers that split incentives, market failures are everywhere. Carbon obviously is a massive market failure. It in many ways is the biggest elephant on the table, but there's no doubt there were split incentives through the 10-year system that we have. Actually, another unpublished study, I'm good at unpublished studies, which I'm not supposed to talk about, but since I'm outside Victoria, about 10 years ago, I did a project for the state government on identifying what the split incentive is in green upgrades of housing in the private rental sector in Victoria. So I did a bunch of interviews with landlords, qualitative interviews, sat down with them, talked about why they've got another house, what they do with it, where it's come from, what their plans are, whether they're planning to cash it up and when, and what are they building a portfolio, etc. All those kind of questions you might ask of a private landlord. And of course, as you know, in Australia, we are a nation of mum and dad investors when it comes to the housing sector. And then that informed me in the design of a survey, and we actually got the rental bond database, and we sent the survey out to every single landlord on the rental bond database in Victoria. We got about 35 or 40%, quite a good response rate. So we got reliable statistical data. And I'm not allowed to talk about it, but I can say that what surprised us was first of all, on the qualitative, I mean, one example stands out. I spoke to this guy that worked in tax, a really rational, accountant, who told a story about his two houses, how one he'd lived in before and he had a particular view about it, and it was kind of, obviously he'd set up home there. Another one, he never met the person who was renting there, but he liked the sound of them, and he would definitely agree if they asked for water tanks, So there's all these kind of relational things that are way beyond what we might think of when we think about markets. There's no doubt that if you ask me about how do people make decisions about getting into the housing market, most of it is not about choice, as Tim's just said. It's about trade-offs and what can I manage, what's possible. I'll get there in a sec. But basically, come back to this study, what we found was that landlords trusted their agents. 80%, north of 80% of these dwellings are managed by agents on behalf of landlords, a key intermediary, who know nothing about green upgrades and don't want to. Frankly, or at least 10 years ago that was the case when I did this work. And there were one or two, and I chased them up and talked to them. But basically I found that the landlords trusted them on everything except green upgrades. We asked them a series of questions about, what kind of arrangement you got in place for automatic replacements of hot water systems, for automatic blah, blah, blah. What about all this stuff about water tanks? Yeah, no, they're clueless. And I think that's a key failure in the system. We don't actually have recognised specialists or jobs to do this work. There's no trusted intermediary. That's a key thing. The other thing is landlords maintain their own properties, because we ask them about their own properties that they live in, about to the same level as they maintain their rental properties. It's either on their radar or it's not on their radar. So this split incentive accounts for about 20 to 25% of the difference between your owner-occupied dwelling itself and the private rental dwelling. It's not the biggest thing. It's crucial, it's important. It's important we fix those market failures right across the system, carbon, et cetera, but if we fix them, we can't then walk away and expect everything to work. Sorry, Alison.
That's okay, Ralph. Can I add to what you were saying?
Please.
And about the whole decision making and the behavioural aspect? you don't know what you don't know, in the sense that if you don't have an embodied carbon value, or if you don't have disclosure for energy performance, that's a huge bugbear. But, you know, I think the lack of interest might not just be because they don't care about green, but there's no data there. There's no data. So, you know, to get the little prompt to get the market behaviour in an information gap where, you know, backpedaling massively. So what I will say, and it's a bit of a plug, it's just, you know, letting you all know what's happening. It's not circular, but from an ASBEC point of view, we believe that if you start to try to tackle the information gap on embodied carbon, you are taking the first step towards understanding what needs to happen in terms of circular changes. So at ASBEC, we've been building on what the Green Building Council has been doing with neighbours. So this is commercial, but if you think about the value chain, it's the same value chain whether you're looking at a commercial property or a residential property. Very similar aspects. We want to ensure that the way we measure, you know, embodied carbon across the value chain is standardised, so that we can compare. We have information there, and so at the very, very least, and we know it's not going to be the panacea, but if people are starting, you know, across the life cycle of a home, if people start to understand the embodied carbon and the consequences of using certain materials or making certain decisions or various intervention points, if they have that information there, then they're more likely, or potentially, they might not, but they at least have the information to make a decision on. So, you know, we think the whole system of reporting, or at least measuring embodied carbon, is one step in the right direction towards encouraging that market behaviour around circularity.
I think the other thing to add to work like that ASBEC is doing, and look, we probably have been extremely focused on carbon for the past decade, for good reasons, one would argue. But the exercise that we've done, and Tim, you probably have a lot to say on this, is the work that we did around, say, Every Building Counts and the low carbon high performance documents across decades, where what we've tried to do is not just go out to say, policymakers and be like, decarbonize and shake them, but actually say, decarbonize, and by the way, can you make this change in the building code? And can you make this change in this other thing? And can you make this thing in tax law? And sometimes with something like circularity, you can go and scream to someone all you want about making things more circular. Most of the time, and I'm like, let's say amateur expert on this, like I wouldn't be able to tell you how. Like, what do you do, right? What's the policy change you want? What's the bit you want to change? What's the thing that they need to write somewhere in the procurement clause to make this happen? And so if we're thinking about how do we encourage those circular market behaviors, some of that is actually to just go from a very high level, yes, we should all be circular, but there's like maybe 5 to 10 things that if we build into the right aspects or we change correctly, we could switch the behavior from maybe going to 100% circular, which is very difficult, but maybe we could get to like 80%. And that's amazing. So that's probably where I kind of try and challenge people these days about some of this stuff. We've been very successful on the carbon side at moving a lot of this legislation. We've done it, say, on the Green Star side around things like electrification. And instead of trying to say, do a whole life carbon budget, we've just gone like electrify. Like that's the thing you have to do. And simplifying those really important systems-based approaches into actual, you know what, change the tax law so that you're not deprecating these things in 3 years, but you can then maximize value later. Like that matters, right? A conversation we had with someone, a retailer, and they go, you gotta understand, we change the fit out like every 5 to 7 years because technically on our tax books, that fit out has no value. So why, it doesn't cost us anything to do it. In fact, if we do the revision, we can then deprecate on the tax and we get benefits. You just go, oh, right. That we should change that. Like you should, like you can extract value out of it, but they're allowed to. So understanding those little bits of the things that are causing the behavior and being very specific about this is the change is where we need to go to actually enable the circular behaviors.
That's great.
Yeah, just to comment on that one, I think it's a really, really good point, and perhaps what's lacking in the CMAG interim report identifies some really good maybe steps towards what Jorge was talking about. But the development of a roadmap for industry, I think, would be a really good practical step in the right direction. Whether it contains all the answers from the roadmap stage, or whether it identifies areas where further research is required, business cases need to be established and the like, I think those could potentially come down the track. But there were two sort of like financial recommendations in there that I wanted to maybe just elevate in this forum. One was the inclusion of circularity in the taxonomy work that's underway at ASFI, and also through the sovereign green bonds process that's also underway. I think those two would go, a long way to start crystallizing some definitions. And then, secondly, the climate-related financial disclosure initiative that's underway, and reporting against IFRS S1 when it comes to the materials and products side of things. I think those will start building capacity internally within organisations who can then perhaps come forward with some more crystallised solutions.
I think it'll also require debt markets to take more accountability for understanding their supply chain, in terms of if they are putting out a mortgage, they've got to do climate-related financial disclosure reporting. They've got to kind of show that money is going towards something that has an impact as well. So I think there's going to be that mandatory disclosure. I think will be a really interesting change in the next year, particularly in the carbon side, right? So, and I think nature's coming very quickly behind that. So that will also, from a materials and a circularity point of view, be really important. And I think that idea of accounting value and depreciation is also really interesting, because that idea that you have to, you depreciate an asset over 3 to 5 years and you make a tax benefit from doing it. There's this concept of the value that debt sees, which is the rear view mirror. There's the value that the accounting value, which is a depreciated value. There's the financial value, which is actually the value that is returned from function, which is different to the accounting value. And then there's the kind of the economic value, which is the broader value to the economy of having that.
And the potential value as well, the remaining, the
residual value. There's and then there's the total value, which is the value socially, environmentally, and economically of that asset in play. And they've got very different drivers. And in terms of a circular approach, I mean, the depreciation value kills me every time. Because I've done climate change analysis for projects, and they've said, but we're depreciating this asset to 0 in 20 years. Why would we invest in something that's going to have an impact in 30 years? I'm like, oh my gosh, of course. You're depreciating, not investing in an appreciated asset that you actually get financial value from.
And it's the same thing that was mentioned about the loan question, right? How often people change houses. And so the question we had, we were talking to one of the mortgages issuers, and the question effectively that we had was well, you should have this in your green criteria. This was a few years back. And they eventually said, well, we'd love to, except that most people change houses earlier, so there's no value in us asking for something that will be that has a 10-year depreciation value. They get no cost-benefit analysis. They don't get any benefit. Now, some of that stuff has fallen back, but batteries are a good example where they're just barely in that cost-benefit analysis ratio, and so it doesn't quite make sense for a typical person to do it.
Because they're going to move.
Because they're going to move. And so, and if they're not then valued by the real estate valuers, they get no benefit from it. And so you just end up in this weird trap of things not happening.
And that's a microcosm. Like I say, we are as a nation kind of stuck in this cycle of housing representing so many different sorts of value. And it's dominated more by the financialisation, which is ongoing and kind of accelerating as we speak. So that becomes, fills the viewfinder, whether it's looking backwards or forwards. It kind of becomes just all-encompassing and all-enveloping. Just going back, Alison, to your point about disclosure and knowing what's going on. I mean, it's so foundational, and it kind of the last few years I've been doing a project on retrofit for the Australian Research Council and Victorian Government and a bunch of other partners. And we've been doing that work in Victoria and the UK, 2 different parts of Victoria and in the UK. And when we first started doing the work in the UK, disclosure wasn't coming up. And I was like, I wonder why. And then I realised that nobody talks about it because they just assume, because they've had labelling of housing
for years.
20 years. So nobody talks about it because it's taken for granted. It's not very good. And it's been kind of privatised and made cheaper, and people don't rely on it so much, and that's a real problem. That undermines confidence in that foundational kind of information. and that's what we should be very wary of. We can't afford to have a bronze rating system for housing.
Yeah, and it's interesting just to make it, to push that point, you have, say, decision makers in Canberra, say politicians pushing it. You know, in Canberra, disclosure of a home's energy performance, again, at sale, that's just a given. And so the misunderstanding or the lack of understanding that this is not a national scheme potentially stops people or stops the decision makers from acting because they just think it's BAU.
I mean, it's interesting, that scheme, which is really long running, is discernible in the marketplace. Even though it's frankly not great and not what we really need, but
it's something.
Even that has a value in the marketplace. It actually does direct investment.
It speaks to the enabling nature of data, though. I think that's really important. The other thing about having disclosure schemes like this is that then you can set long-term policy.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. We actually, like, NatHERS has existed for a long time, right? It's been running for, like, 25 years or 20 years, something like that.
Yeah.
And it is effectively like a great idea. It was a star rating that was designed to tell you from a scale of 1 to 5, then 10, what your house was. Like, that's fantastic. What we tend to do wrong here, which interestingly enough, and I'd be interested to know if you have any insights on this, Ralph, but is the way that other countries have used similar scales. So in the UK, they set out, I think it was Part L, which was the housing code. And they did, like, you start at F and they go all the way to A. And they did it in 2007, and I think they ended up going like, okay, by 2014, all of our housing, new housing, has to be like level A. Right now it's at here, you're going to be a level A, and this is what everything means. Knock yourself out, we'll see you in 7 years, right, give or take. And what started happening was that builders were saying, well, if I'm going to have to build in 7 years to like level A, and my supply chain contracts like expire in 3 years, I'm not going to go to the level C, I might as well redo them for level A. And they started getting better houses very quickly. But in Australia, the way that I like to describe it is we like to do policy by surprise. So everyone's just walking around and they're like, oh, next year, 7 stars. And everyone was like, whoa, we can't do that. Whereas if we'd gone and said, okay, between now and, like, let's assume in 2018, we'd gone like between now and 2030. By 2030, we all want to see 8 stars. I guarantee you we'd have 8-star housing. Because that would make it clear, right? We know that's a goal. We know the mechanism. We know the measurement model. And then the supply chain can say things like, okay, well, to get to 8 stars, very likely only double glazing. So what are you going to do? You build double glazing factories. And so those are elements that we actually just also need to be clever. And if we think about the circular economy problem, it's the same problem. The embodied carbon problem is the same thing. If tomorrow we're like, okay, we need to reduce embodied carbon by 30% next year, I can tell you no one's going to do that. It's not possible. But if we do say it, we give people the time, and you know, admittedly, the politics make this challenging. I'm not dissuading, and the UK is an excellent example of how policy scrapped all of that. But the principle holds. Like, let's try not to surprise people, and I think that matters. And circularity is going to fall in the same thing. So we do need to get better at doing policy, and we need to get better at announcing policy and holding ourselves to that policy better.
Yeah, great points to finish on. I'm conscious I'm standing between you and lunch. And if you've got questions, please do. The panel's here, I'm here. But that's a fantastic point to finish on. It makes me think about how we apply this long-range policy to appliances, to automotive, to other sectors, but somehow, I love that, policy by surprise is what happens in the building sector. And I kind of, that's an unforgettable. And even where we have got a stepped, agreed approach in the building code, we delay them. So yeah, look, it's always possible. There's no non-return valves. It's always possible to unmake and to go backwards. There's always that risk. We need to keep this conversation about the Overton window and the value conversation in the front and the centre of our minds. Because, yes, doing this very important work of building a regulatory framework, a roadmap, telling everybody, and that's all crucial, but also we have to have the values conversation as part of that and around that. We also have to think about allocation and distribution of housing because at the moment we've got more of a hoarding problem than we have a supply problem, frankly. And so all of these have to come into a rather, a rather complex, muddy web of responsibilities, as Alison described right at the beginning. There's just hundreds of different jurisdictional considerations and silos that need to be negotiated. I want to finish by saying I really don't think we can afford to point the finger anywhere. We just need to share this problem, and because pointing the finger has got us nowhere near where we need to get to, and we have no time left. We have no carbon left. We don't have enough people to build what we need, and we can't build it because we don't have the carbon. So we've got to think about different ways of doing this. So on that note, it's lunch. Tom, have I forgotten anything?
That's great. Perfect.
All good? Lunch is here. Enjoy. See you back here afterwards, which is 1:30. Thank you.